Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 8th of May, 2024, and we come to you today at the beginning of what will be a new weekly series on this channel, which is the weekly series where we work through the collection of writings from Stalin entitled, and I'm going to hold this up to the camera so you can see it, On the Opposition. You probably can't see it because it's blurry. The book itself can be found on our website because I've managed to find a online copy, a PDF that is available for download. So what I'm going to do, what I've done is I have linked that on the Telegram group. So I'm just going to drop the link to the page where you can find the ebook version on the chat here, so you can take a look at that. And we're going to be starting off with the very first section from that, entitled Our Differences and our disagreements. I'm going to be looking at that today. But first of all, I'll say a few words about why I've decided to start this series, because a legitimate question could be posed as to, why why do this at all? This is a collection of writings that covers debates that ran in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, that's their official title at the time, from 1921 up to 1927. So that's 6 years or so. And why bother with this? Why go into the details of arguments that happened nominally, if you believe the bourgeois historians, just between Stalin and Trotsky, but of course that was never the case. Both of them representing a majority and a minority within the party. So why do it? Now, the answer to that question is that the issues that are actually under discussion there are not only are they live issues. So, for instance, the writing of Stalin's we're going to be looking at tonight is a discussion of the way in which the trade unions were organized inside the early Soviet Union and how they came to be organized as time went on, and the various different tendencies that emerged in the very early 1920s in the Bolshevik Party, and what they represented, why they emerged, and what that meant in terms of the personalities and the individuals that are associated with them, why these various different tendencies were flawed, what the changes happened in the Bolshevik Party as a result of these debates. And all of that is still very relevant, because the question of how to organize a trade union under a workers' state is very much a live issue, because there are still some socialist states flying the red flag around the world. And it's important in terms of the debates about, well, how are trade unions, for instance, organized in the People's Republic of China or Laos or Vietnam or Cuba or the DPRK. So that's a live issue. But also, and this is the broader issue beyond the individual points that the writings will be working through are covering, the broader issue is that the Trotskyite narrative that has gripped in the West, change of season means increased hay fever. The issues being debated between, well, nominally Stalin and Trotsky, but in reality the majority and the minority in the Bolshevik Party. The minority position, i.e. Trotsky's position, came to be the position that is embraced by, of course, most of the Western left, particularly after the treacherous speech by the rat Khrushchev in 1956. But also the Trotsky narrative is so powerful because it is constantly reinforced by the bourgeoisie. So the debates that actually took place between the majority of the party and the minority of the party, which was at various stages led by Trotsky himself, Bukharin on both the extreme left and then the extreme right of the party. At various different points, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and in the very early stages, Alexandra Kollontai. At various different stages, these oppositional figures grouped together to form a coherent group or a broadly coherent group. And their program, what they stood for, is never really discussed anymore. It's just assumed, well, the great evil man Stalin seized control from the virtuous Trotsky, and that's really all that is said about it, including by the Trotskyists themselves, who don't even read the collected works of Trotsky from this particular period. I have an advantage, well, such as it is, in that I have read them over 10 years ago now, since I first read them, and I've now read the majority's response, Stalin's response, if you will. But as I will keep emphasizing as we go through these various different writings, Stalin in this book is always delivering reports to the Central Committee, to the Party Congress, to various different meetings, which he is addressing in his capacity as the CPSUB General Secretary. So he's not just, pulling this off the top of his head. He's speaking for the majority position. He's speaking for the position that the party has endorsed via its democratic processes. And so to say it's just Stalin, of course, Stalin's input into what he says is going to be important. But the idea that it's Trotsky versus Stalin, no, it's two men who came to be associated with a majority and a minority tendency within the CPSUB. That's the way to view this. It's also the way to view debates within parties, communist parties up to this day. It's the way to view, for instance, the writings of somebody like Xi Jinping, which is that this isn't just stuff he's pulling out of thin air that he writes in the articles that are published under his name, in the speeches that he gives, in the things that he says. This is the majority position, the decided upon position of the Communist Party of China. And so I want to emphasize that, because far too often it is boiled down to the personality. It's Trotsky versus Stalin. And this is done a lot by the Trotskyites themselves, of course, and of course further reinforced by Khrushchev and his supporters later on. So we will move through this book week by week by week, and take questions as to the nature of what we're covering, and then move on to sort of a summary at the end of what will be quite a lengthy series. So this is going to be an interesting thing for me, and I hope interesting for you as well. If you have little more lengthy questions that obviously we can't address on the streams, then the thing to do is, of course, email me at the usual address. So we're going to just do the traditional greetings through the chat. So we have so far with us Otis, who says, "Very good evening, comrades. On the eve of the defeat of Nazi Germany by the first workers' state, the great USSR. Solidarity to all brothers and sisters." And that is a fine sentiment indeed. Grassy Knoll says, "Good afternoon, comrades from Seattle, Washington." Boyo says, "I just watched a clip of the Big Cheese at the National Endowment for Democracy talking about how he won't give up fighting for Georgians." He's definitely not fighting for Georgians any more than Joe Biden is fighting for Ukraine. They are like the archetypal witch that promises the innocent child sweets. Well, I think plenty of Georgians realize what's going on. I think what's been revealed, and we've covered this many times before in the regime change business, is that if you flood a country with money, you can recruit quite a lot of people, especially from that most dreadful of class formations, the aspirational middle class, who feel that they should be earning like Western money. Those are always the people who turn out to be the worst traitors. Those are always the people who are the foot soldiers of like the Maidan aided and abetted, of course, by they're the brains and the people who get it on camera in the initial period. But behind them stand the muscle of like the lumpenized elements, the fascists, organized by a combination of foreign intelligence services and oligarchs. Working class Georgians won't get much of a look into this so-called opposition movement. The only ones who've dealt with this correctly in the recent era are, of course, the Russians have managed to drain this particular swamp for now. It always risks refilling, shall we say. But Lukashenko was very successful in thus far in making sure that a color revolution didn't go ahead. And to be quite blunt about it, the only way to deal with this is to like ban all these organizations, not put them on a foreign agents register. Maybe do that as your first move, then ultimately ban them all and lock up anybody who runs them. Repress the hell out of it. And I think it's completely justified, because if you allow these people in Georgia to have control of Georgia, they'll finish the job that Saakashvili started all the way back 20 years ago, which is they'll drive Georgia into a ditch. They'll set up some kind of confrontation with the Russians purely on the orders of the US imperialists, and Georgia will get destroyed. And the US imperialists will weep crocodile tears and walk away to the next project, just as Pashinyan in Armenia is now destroying Armenia on the orders of the imperialists, purely so that they can try and find some angle to work against the Russians. They don't care if Armenia is destroyed. And all these, to be quite frank, fucking idiots who, or treacherous scumbags who are prepared to tank Armenia or Georgia, just as their equivalents were prepared to tank Ukraine for a few dollars from the US. Well, to be quite frank, these people are the scum of the earth and should be treated as such, because they are prepared to destroy the nation that they apparently want to see elevated. They are prepared to destroy that country. They're prepared to have Wall Street parasites asset strip it to the bone, and are prepared to have it turned into a militarized garrison state for US imperialism, which will then be hurled ineffectually at the Russians, and then the country will be destroyed. So what other way is there to describe these people other than treacherous scum? There's no excuse for what they're doing now. Like you can't lie to yourself that much that you can possibly think that what is happening in Ukraine is somehow Ukraine winning. Like you maybe could lie to yourself up to about maybe summer of last year. Maybe it's up to summer of last year if you're drinking all the, to use an Americanism, the Kool-Aid, if you're huffing on the fumes of the NAFO bots and the propagandists, then maybe you could believe up to that point that they had the bad man Putin on the run. But after that so-called counteroffensive, when, what was it, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians died and they got absolutely nowhere, they got destroyed. After that, when even in the Ukrainian press, they're admitting it's all going wrong, to believe, if you're Georgian or you're Armenian, if you can believe that being on the NATO and EU path is a path to anything other than destruction, then I hope the paycheck is really, really good, because that's the only reason for you doing this. That should be the only reason you can possibly be doing this, to buy yourself out of a nation that you are prepared to ruin. And if you're prepared to do that to your own country, then again, I will re-emphasize the point. People like that are the scum of the earth. They've always existed in every historical era, and they always should get the same treatment, which I won't specify here, but they're treacherous fascist scum, and they'll all end up like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya of Belarus, hanging around NATO headquarters in the EU begging for money so that her and her court of compradors can be kept in the manner to which they have become accustomed to. So quite frankly, fuck these people. Svetlana, good evening to you. And Svetlana says, comradely greetings from Moscow, where the city is gearing up for Victory Day tomorrow. Indeed. I'll be tuning into some of the coverage of the parade there. Yoav Peckelman says hello, and we say hello back. Gonzalo Cabrera says good evening from Madrid. Greetings, says Ben, from Hungary, where Xi Jinping is due to arrive in the coming days. Yes, very interesting tour that President Xi has been on to apparently what was a very frustrating meeting for him with Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, where Macron did his usual thing of saying, "Oh well, we want a good relationship with China." Then von der Leyen just repeated everything that Janet Yellen had told her to say about Chinese overcapacity. And Macron started moaning about the Chinese overproducing. But the thing is, well, Macron should have a word then with his own capitalist class, because in terms of you buying Chinese imports, if too many imports are coming into France, Emmanuel, then it's because the businesses in France are buying them. So they're being brought into France to be sold on French shelves, or on, if it's cars, on French forecourts, or in French supermarchés. Well, then, if there's too many imports coming in, then why is it that the French capitalist class are doing all these deals and doing all this importing? It's because they can make more money buying commodities from China and selling them in France. That's why it's happening. It's quite simple, really. It's not the Chinese that are running down French industry or destroying French production. It's the French capitalist class that are doing that. But Macron, of course, being a pure product of the French capitalist class, of course, being a banker by trade, is under the impression that if he gets the Chinese to try and destroy their own industrial capacity, destroy their own export markets, that somehow French capitalism is going to revive itself? Absolutely not. This proves only that either Emmanuel Macron has no understanding of how capitalism works, which, being a banker and a rather out of touch one at that, is eminently possible, or he's just doing a dance for public consumption, which no one will believe. So yes, it doesn't look like President Xi had a particularly good time in France. Apparently, he and Macron had to agree to take a one-on-one meeting with no translators present, or no other staff present other than the security men, because Xi didn't trust that people in Macron's team wouldn't leak any comments that he made in the discussion with Macron to the press, after, of course, Macron's team leaked many of his discussions with Putin 2 years ago to the press. So in the end, Macron had to agree to a one-on-one meeting whilst the two of them walked through the foothills of some mountain range in France somewhere. Because, of course, both Xi and Macron speak English, which is interesting. I think both of them pretty damn perfectly, given Xi spent quite some time in the United States in the early to mid-80s studying. And Macron, of course, speaks perfect English. Jerry, good evening to you from a still almost sunny Hampshire. Good to have you with us. Svetlana says, I was comparing the Russian and English translation of Stalin's On the Opposition today. The English translation needs to be improved. Well, this is interesting. Maybe this is work we can commission. Good evening to Rob and Beans from the wrong side of the Pennines, who Beans has finished her Socialist Balloons, which Rob was talking about the last time we were on the stream here, and you've posted that in the Telegram group, and very interesting it is too. Artistic talent is something I entirely lack, but I liked the idea of the balloons with the flags on from the former people's democracies rising up. In my view, that meant they were rising again. It's a wonderful thing about art. It lends itself to many different interpretations, but that's how I saw it. Ben says, I just watched Karine Jean-Pierre say that the US and Ukraine defeated Hitler and Stalin 79 years ago. While Berlin is an ally, the threat from the East persists. You say you're still in shock, but, well, Ben, you're from Hungary. The eastern end of Europe has been doing this shit for years. Like the Baltic, the yapping reactionary dogs of the Baltic have been doing this shit for years. I mean, sooner or later, it's going to be that the US and Hitler and Ukraine defeated Stalin in 1991 by setting up a McDonald's in East Berlin. I mean, it's cartoon history, but then again, they've been doing this for many years. They were telling lies about World War II as soon as it ended. I mean, there were the idea that the Soviet army raped every woman in Germany still put about to this day. That one started as soon as the war ended. The Nazis were putting that around, and the Americans and the British aided them. So they've been telling escalating lies about World War II for 79 years. And now, of course, they're 33 years away from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the latter period of the Soviet Union, they managed to get the Soviet leadership to basically betray the veterans of the Great Patriotic War and start agreeing with the claims of the Polish and the Baltic and, of course, the German reactionaries. So they've been left a free hand. It's only relatively recently, and we're talking really only since 2014, that the Russian government has actually started to more and more aggressively combat these lies. And really, it's only in the last 2 years that they've really started to actually use the Soviet records effectively. They weren't prepared to do it before then, because that would mean, of course, talking about the man that they don't want to talk about, or one of the men they don't want to talk about, which is, of course, Stalin, and the lies that were told about him, not just by the West, but by Khrushchev and by Gorbachev and by Yeltsin and by Putin. So, again, this is what happens. The revisionists opened the door for this, and the pro-capitalist Russian leadership opened the door for this. Now they've suddenly realized, well, in the last few years, that this is now presenting them with a problem, and they've decided to combat it. Well, I welcome the fact that they are, but they're a bit late to this party. Grover Furr's been doing it for years. Okay. Spurious Furious, good evening to you. And DE, good evening to you. And Comrade Ian Foster joins us. Luca says, evening, comrades. Question: I recently came across Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Do you know him? And if so, do you like his work? I'm finding his interviews interesting. His work exposing the so-called French theorists is interesting. Politically speaking, I believe he's aligned with the PSL in the United States, who are Trotskyite in origin, which makes me a little bit suspicious of his politics. He's also into certain things that are a bit of a pet obsession of the American petty bourgeois left, such as like the climate change narrative and the obsession with identity politics. He's displayed a bit of a tendency towards both of them. So interesting, but I would, as always with academics, approach with caution. Koba on Twitter says, weren't there thousands of members in the Central Committee of the USSR? Stalin only had one vote, the same as the others. Maybe not thousands, but there was thousands voting in the party Congress. And again, yes, you're right, which is Stalin only had one vote in the Central Committee. So, like, the idea of Stalin, the bad guy, manipulating everybody is a bit absurd, really, when you consider the forces involved and the impossibility of like one man manipulating everybody. Putin's shirt, good evening to you. Ben says, I knew things were heading in this direction gradually, but straight from the official White House spokeswoman was shocking. Well, she lies as easily as she breathes. Clinton joins us from London. Kevin joins us from Sligo. GCCX Pro says, Stalin, the only true disciple, continuator of the great Lenin. Good. And Abtin joins us. Good evening to you. Martin joins us from Vienna and is looking forward to the topic tonight. Ben enjoyed the answers on the comprador class. Well, there's no point going delicately with these people. If they're taking the American money to destroy their own country, then there's only really one way to treat them. Martin says, this elite has so much blood on their hands, but the Ukraine project is falling apart fast. Happy Victory Day to all the people of the former USSR, and thank God for the Red Army. Indeed. DE says, yes, at this late stage in the game, being a mid-level comprador seems especially stupid. Yeah, why on earth would you bother? Zouter, greetings to you over there on the wrong side of the Pennines in Bradford, West Yorkshire. And Robbie, you'll enjoy the interpretation of the People's Republic's rising again. Well, that's how I saw it, because that's where history will go. The Zouter says that Red Army lie can be sourced from before the Red Army even crossed into Berlin. Interesting. Muzzle Paint has joined us. Manuel has joined us from Atlanta. Jawad joins us. Good evening to you, comrade. Jan Zizka says, also glad to listen to someone who isn't a vague reactionary of one stripe or another. Well, I'm neither a reactionary or vague, so hopefully you will enjoy the program. Right, okay, so let's get into this then. We are talking tonight of the very first chapter in this book, first section entitled Our Disagreements, and this is nominally at least related to the debate that took place in the CPSUB in the early 1920s regarding the question of trade unions. Now, it's important here to set a little bit of historical context before getting into the meat of the issue. By 1921, the bulk of the fighting in the Civil War was over, and the Russian Civil War, which had run roughly from the end of 1917 through to 1921. So almost 4 years of brutal war, following on from 3 years of brutal imperialist war in World War One. So by 1921, though, the armies of the counter-revolutionaries, so Kolchak, Denikin, Rangel, people like that, had been defeated, largely defeated. A few holdouts were still scattered around the place, but also the armies of foreign intervention from Britain, France, the United States and Japan, amongst others, had been mostly driven out. Again, few holdouts, but the territorial integrity of what was becoming the USSR was firming up now. So the war had largely been won by that stage. And during the period of the war, there was in place a program of what is known as war communism. Now, what this was essentially a very militarized period where, due to the fact that the Soviet Union was under attack from inside, the internal reactionaries led by the Tsarist generals, some of whom I've just mentioned, and also supported by the armies of intervention. So again, Britain, France, the United States and Japan being the biggest contributors, but there were Italians were there as well. There was the attack of the Polish reactionaries in 1920, led by former Polish socialist Józef Pilsudski. The character of the Polish reactionaries back then and the character of them now is roughly about the same. So you had the country under attack from the east, from the west, from foreign intervention armies. You had the reactionary armies led by the white generals attacking from within. This necessitated some fundamental changes in the way that the Soviet state was organized. For instance, in the early period, immediately after the October Revolution and before it, the way that the units of the army were organized was essentially that it was the soldiers' committees in the armies that were running everything. Of course, when you're in a war, and when you are needing to make decisions quickly, you essentially can't afford, for efficiency's sake, to have a debate about every single issue. So what was decided upon with regard to how the army was organized, and bear in mind the army, even though it has proletarians within it in Russia in 1917, 18, 19, 20, the bulk of the men were peasants from the countryside still. And therefore, the proletarian content of the army was actually quite low. So they needed to do two things. They needed to essentially turn the Red Army from being this sort of loose group of demoralized former soldiers in the Tsarist army, to being a revolutionary force that could actually fight and win this war against the foreign interventionist and the domestic reactionaries. So to do that, they had to reinstitute the command of the officers. They had to bring in Tsarist trained officers who were regarded as military specialists to formulate and carry out battle plans. But the way this was going to be done was that these men were going to be essentially watched by a political structure. So this is where the political commissar system comes from. The idea being that, yes, you needed the military specialists to do all the technical things that military specialists are trained in, but you can't trust these people. They're from often an enemy class. you need to have revolutionaries who maybe aren't skilled at the military art, but are going to basically keep a watch on these people from a political point of view and make sure they don't turn traitorous, as some of them did. So the system of worker and peasant democracy in the army had to be ended for efficiency's sake in order to win the war, replaced by the commissar system to make sure that the military specialists stayed on the level. And this was a system that was actually very successful. Following the early setbacks, they were able to actually win the war, despite, again, losing battles to the likes of Pilsudski in what's now Western Ukraine. But they were able to win that war, drive out the armies of foreign intervention, defeat the domestic reactionaries, or drive them into exile. Some of them ended up over the border in China for many, many years. And there were border skirmishes along the border with China with the white Russian emigres all the way into the 1930s. So this is part of the background. What we refer to as war communism, though, also refers to, and it more refers to this, which is the system of military expropriations, or expropriations from the peasants of their grain. So given the dreadful state of agriculture in 1917, and a lot of it teetering on the verge of collapse, and the fact that the peasants, having got the land off the landowners, and remember the promises of the Bolsheviks, peace, bread, and land, many of the peasants wanted to go back to farming their own land and not sending grain to the cities, which of course would have meant the cities starved and the army starved, and Soviet power wouldn't have lasted too long if that happened. So they had to essentially force the peasants to give up the grain that the cities needed and that the army needed. And this was sometimes done by force. This was sometimes done literally at gunpoint. So this is a rough time where the Bolshevik party and the new government in what was becoming the RSFSR had to take tough measures in order to make sure that the revolution survived and that the integrity of the state was held together. And during this time, you have what I would describe as a form of crude egalitarianism reigning, which is that whether you were Lenin himself or whether you were a worker at the Putilov works in Petrograd, you were on a very restricted diet. The amount of calories in the average Russian's diet back then was very limited. War rationing was in place. And so what you get is that though the rule of the Bolsheviks had become militarized in some senses in order to win the war, you had this very sort of crude egalitarianism that was in place throughout the period of war communism. And you see this even in capitalist societies where there is an existential threat, where there is an all-out war. The differences between the classes, even in capitalism, start to dissipate a little bit, even in such a hierarchically stratified society such as Britain. In the Second World War, that is, because the pressure of the masses was so great, the ruling class was obliged to share in the sacrifices, even to the smallest degree. It did produce, at least for a little while, a sense of national unity that the bourgeoisie were happy to exploit. But in this case, where you had a rule of the workers and peasants, or a state built for the worker, built by and for the workers and peasants, and you had this almost like total equality between the men who ran the state and the people that worked within it to maintain it, it gave many people the idea that this was going to be the way forward, that this was going to be, I've seen quotes from people who are deeply religious or Christian communists who saw the almost universal poverty in Soviet Russia in 1920 to 21 and saw it as like the coming of the kingdom of Christ upon earth, because it was a situation where of almost complete egalitarianism. Now, what Lenin pointed out because 1921 is very significant because it's his last full year as the chair of the government. So it's his last full active year. He's active. He's riding a bit in 1922, but his health goes into a very steep decline shortly thereafter. So this is significant in terms of it's his last full year of activity, proper activity as head of government. And this is when, of course, he brings in the new economic policy. The new economic policy is designed, as Lenin observes and as Stalin observes, to essentially restart production properly in the countryside, to enable greater production of grain. The Bolshevik government decided that, well, we have to introduce a certain degree of incentivization by profit. We have to allow the peasants to sell their grain again, and resorts to, rather than seizure of grain to feed the cities, will resort to a system of taxation rather than forced requisition, and will allow a certain degree of the private market to exist, will allow certain people to profit. These were later known as the net men, new economic policy men. And this is essentially a tactical retreat in order to essentially build up again. We need to build up production in the countryside, away from the devastation. When we got over the devastation of the war, industrial production we need to spend time accumulating capital again, in order that we can expand industry later. So Stalin says there's many different types of retreat, and this was a necessary retreat, and it, of course, offended the left of the Bolshevik Party, which at that time was personified by a man who'd later personify the right less than a decade later, Nikolai Bukharin, and his associates, people like Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, who both of whom saw in the war communist period a way forward. Now, Lenin and the majority argued that it wasn't, what was going on in actual fact was that the Bolshevik Party, which is meant to be the party which is organically linked to the masses, there was a risk, if the war communism policy was continued, that the party would be running far too far ahead of the masses, that it would be asking the masses to endlessly sacrifice whilst not doing anything to actually improve the material conditions of the workers and the peasants, and therefore you risk alienating yourself completely. See, the vanguard has to lead, but it cannot run too far ahead. And this was what Lenin was constantly pointing out. You on the left, the left of the party, might think that the absolute egalitarianism or rough egalitarianism of the war communist period is this great thing, but it's not helping us restart production. It's not helping us get agriculture going again. Therefore, a tactical retreat is necessary in order that forces can be built up again to later go and carry through the industrialization that would later be carried out in the 5-year plans, and carry through collectivization that would later be carried out partially through the demands made by the peasants themselves and partially through the planned collectivization process. But until then, we just need to get a certain amount of production going again, and a reversion to certain capitalist methods is required. So that's the background to this, to what is going on in 1921. Now, the debates that Stalin is referring to here over the trade union question, these are part of that wider context. So there's several lines over the trade union issue going on in terms of debates inside the party in 1921. There's Alexandra Kollontais' group called the Workers' Opposition, who were arguing, broadly speaking, that in actual fact power should pass to the trade unions directly, and that the role of the party should be significantly downgraded. And this was essentially putting forward a syndicalist point of view. You have then Trotsky and others arguing that in a sort of very strange way, that the trade unions should essentially be run on the same grounds that the army was run, that the trade unions should be organs of discipline for the disciplining of labor, and that the question of force, i.e., basically using the same methods of force that were used in the war communism period in the period of peace, and that was the Trotsky position, a position which is so bad. Even people like Ernest Mandel, who wrote a glowing biography of Trotsky, which I've read, even Ernest Mandel can't defend it. He says it's a horrible lapse into authoritarianism. Now, when I first read this book and I first picked up a copy of this 10 years ago, I was still a Trotskyite at the time. I was genuinely shocked to see that it was Trotsky who was personifying all of the things that he would later accuse Stalin of, which is rule by force, compelling workers to essentially produce more in less time, to be more productive, essentially by holding them at gunpoint. And this is what Stalin, representing the majority position as formulated by Lenin and the majority on the Central Committee, this is what Stalin in this article is arguing against. So this is, I'm going to read some quotes here. And Stalin subtitles his article here, Two Methods of Approach to the Mass of the Workers. And I'll just begin by reading this out. And he's referring to disagreements principally with Trotsky. Our disagreements are about questions of the means by which to strengthen labor discipline in the working class, the methods of approach to the mass of the workers who are being drawn into the work of reviving industry, the ways of transforming the present weak trade unions into powerful, genuinely industrial unions capable of reviving our industry. So there was an agreement, as Stalin says there in that particular excerpt, on the need to improve the productivity of Soviet industry. Everybody agreed upon that. The question was, well, how are we going to organize that in a way that actually draws the mass of workers into being more productive? And Stalin's point of view here, the point of view he's articulating, is that, well, that needs to be done through a process of agitation and education. The workers themselves need to embrace the idea that productivity needs to improve. And that needs to be done, as Stalin goes on to say here, by methods of persuasion. So, next quote comes shortly after that, and here he explains the division that is at play here. Quote reads as follows. A group of party workers headed by Trotsky, intoxicated by the successes achieved by military methods in the army, supposes that these methods can and must be adopted among the workers in the trade unions in order to achieve similar successes in strengthening the unions and in reviving industry. But this group forgets that the army and the working class are two different spheres, that a method that is suitable for the army may prove to be unsuitable, harmful for the working class and its trade unions. So essentially what Stalin is saying there is that we may have resorted to these military methods in the army. We may have resorted to the restoration of the officer corps, the rule by the running of the military units on more traditional military lines. We may have resorted to grain requisitions, but this is the time when everybody could feel an existential threat of foreign invasion or domestic reactionaries seizing power again. Now the situation has calmed down. It requires a different approach. The situation is calm, but the situation is still urgent. So what Stalin is arguing here is that the army, of course, has a different composition. It's mostly peasants, so we have to bear in mind that, but also that when you're formulating a policy that is designed to try and form a new organization of trade unions, again, this has to be done in a new and different way, reflecting the new and changed situations. So Stalin goes on to say and talk about the fact that that Trotsky, and I'll read the quote again. The mistake Trotsky makes is that he underrates the difference between the army and the working class. He puts the trade unions on a par with the military organizations and tries, evidently by inertia, to transfer military methods from the army into the trade unions, into the working class. So he then goes on to quote from one of Trotsky's documents. He's saying that there needs to be, where Trotsky's arguing over and over again, there needs to be military discipline imposed on the trade unions. And again, Stalin's arguing that this is an absolutely disastrous point of view. And evidently, the Bolshevik Party at the time agreed with the position formulated by Lenin and expressed by Stalin that this was not a good idea, that trying to run the trade unions on military lines is an appalling idea. Now, what was the actual policy and what became the actual policy regarding trade unions under socialism, we'll go on to in just a moment. So Stalin then goes on to state a point of view about what he calls conscious democracy and forced democracy. So he says, democracy in the trade unions, i.e. what is usually called normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, is the conscious democracy characteristic of mass working class organizations, which presupposes consciousness of the necessity and utility of systematically employing methods of persuasion among the millions of workers organized in the trade unions. If that consciousness is absent, democracy becomes an empty sound. So, what does this actually mean? What he's saying there is that, let's go back to when he means proletarian democracy. When he talks about the proletarian democracy in the trade unions, he's talking about the building of the trade unions as organizations not of the relationship that he's had between trade unions and employers in this country or in any capitalist country. It's that the trade unions, in the view of Lenin and Stalin, should be serving as essentially training grounds for workers in order that workers can participate in the management of industry. And this is what the Pat Sloan argues in his book on Soviet democracy. Sloan was an educator who worked in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. That was published by the old Communist Party of Great Britain back at the end of the 1930s, his reflections on the Soviet state. So, bear in mind what Stalin is saying here, which is that if the conscious democracy characteristic of mass working class organizations, which presupposes consciousness of the necessity and utility of systematically employing methods of persuasion among the millions of workers organized in the trade unions. So what he's saying there is that when it comes to the productivity in Soviet industry, the Bolshevik Party's job is to go out and agitate amongst the working class to make the Soviet working class understand the severity of the situation and the need for increased productivity, and that the trade unions are organs which can be used to do that and draw the working class into actually participating in this drive for greater productivity, and that this will be a way of winning the working class to this position. And that's how true Bolsheviks should act. Trotsky's position was essentially that we will go in, I, the great leader, or my designated prophet on earth, will go before them, and I will make their great speech agitating in front of them, saying, we must work harder, brothers, forward, forward. And then once we've done that, maybe once, maybe twice, then we'll do it at the barrel of a gun. Now, that's not going to make the workers embrace you or embrace the idea of greater productivity. If you tell them once, you tell them twice, and if they don't listen to you a third time, then you pull a gun on them. This isn't a particularly good idea in terms of developing the consciousness of the workers. Stalin and Lenin were arguing constantly that the Revolutionary Party needs to maintain its links with the workers and build them and draw the workers into the management of industry, find new militants amongst the working class and draw the best of them into the party. Use the trade unions as organs of, again, training workers as to how to participate in the management of industry. These are the way that the trade unions should be constructed, not as militarized organizations, which is what Trotsky wanted. So, further to that point about how to actually get the millions of workers to embrace the idea of the need for greater industrial productivity, Stalin says the following: to rouse the millions of the working class for the struggle against economic ruin, It is necessary to heighten their initiative, consciousness, and independent activity. It is necessary, by means of concrete facts, to convince them that economic ruin is just as real and mortal a danger as the war danger was yesterday. It is necessary to draw millions of workers into the work of reviving industry through the medium of trade unions built on democratic lines. Only in this way is it possible to make the entire working class vitally interested in the struggle which the economic organizations are waging against economic ruin. If this is not done, victory on the economic front cannot be achieved. In short, conscious democracy, the method of proletarian democracy in the unions, is the only correct method for the industrial unions. Forced democracy has nothing in common with this democracy. So, what he is arguing there is that, look, the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia at that stage, has a serious problem in terms of industries ruined, the terrible effects of nearly a decade of war on what was then Soviet Russian industry were ruinous, that we needed an urgent revival, but we can only get that if the Bolshevik Party consciously is able to win over the proletariat to the urgency, to view that as an urgent challenge, to be prepared to make sacrifices in order to actually increase go through an economic, to build an economic recovery. And that cannot be done by militarization. It can only be done by raising the level of consciousness of the masses, by getting the masses to embrace the idea of industrialization, to embrace their role in it as workers. And again, that can only be done by drawing them into, as Stalin says there, the management of the system, to have them consciously involved in the rebuilding of industry. And this is a process which takes a number of years to do, because again, it is often the case that the best of the working class, the most politicized elements, have been the first to die in the war, as they were later to do in the Great Patriotic War, far too many of them. And so essentially the working class that is now going into the factories, these people need to be won over to a program of mass industrialization. And this is going to take a number of years to do. While we win over the working class to this program, it was necessary to restore certain capitalist methods in industry in order to stimulate economic growth, whilst at the same time you wage a political struggle via the trade unions and the party to win the working class over to this point of view. This is this is the way in which the Bolshevik Party was going about it all the way through the 1920s. What Lenin insisted upon, and later Stalin insisted upon, was that you have to constantly be drawing the workers into discussion, winning them over to this position. And it takes a number of years before, of course, things are ready to go. Before you've actually increased the number of workers in the party, you've built these new trade unions, which Stalin is talking about in this article. You've reached a level of activity and consciousness amongst the masses where they are prepared to embrace the challenge of mass industrialization that needs to come through the 5-year plans. And so this is why it takes from 1921 through to about 1929, when you go through this period of restoration of certain capitalist methods, where you go through the period of the kulaks making profits, certain speculators making profits. But all that time, the Bolshevik Party is waging a fierce political struggle amongst the working class and amongst the peasants. But again, amongst the working class, it's particularly urgent to rebuild the links with the proletariat, to make sure that a new and politicized layer of proletarians is ready to seize this challenge for mass industrial development that will follow from 1929 onwards with the beginning of the 5-year plans. And that's what Stalin's arguing for in this article, that this is going to take, see, what you get from the Trotskyists is, and Tariq Ali argues this way, as do various others, that well, Trotsky said there should be mass industrialization by 1924, from 1924 to 25 onwards. But of course, again, like Trotsky's method, which is what Stalin is arguing against here, is that is that basically I, the great leader, have decreed that there should be mass industrialization. Go do it. And of course, Trotsky's method of basically running everything in this sort of militarized fashion, where which worked apparently, though I've yet to review his full record in the Civil War, but apparently this made him quite an effective general, quite an effective commissar of war, because he would go around the country essentially making these inspirational speeches and then basically say, right, lads, get to it. Get out there and fight, and the whole thing would be done on the basis of like the peasant soldiers being ordered out there. Things would be run on not typical military lines, because it was still a system that was heavily politicized, and the role of the political commissars was significant in terms of keeping control of the military experts. But it was still run on the lines of, it was a more revolutionary version of a conventional army. And Trotsky tries to bring that method back into organizing amongst the trade unions and in terms of organizing the proletariat. So again, let's go back to what Trotsky's own biographers say about him, which is that he had no patience. He wouldn't persistently argue for a position. He'd like throw a fit basically and walk out. And his idea that even Ernest Mandel admits to, his most admiring biographer, that his idea for the trade unions was essentially to run them on the same basis that he'd run the Red Army, which you can't do. As Stalin indicates, like the situation has changed. You cannot carry on with the policies from the war communism period because, again, the objective reality has moved on, and therefore the consciousness of the masses has changed with it. And therefore also the years of war and the sheer number of deaths and the amount of destruction has gone on mean now that you have to, as the Bolshevik party has to rebuild its links with the masses, you have to develop the consciousness of the masses in a new way. You have to win them to the program of mass industrialization. You have to have the working class themselves understand it, realize that this is something which they are contributing directly to, and is something which is very much under their control, and embrace this challenge collectively. You only get that through consistent agitation, education, and the development of consciousness. You do not get it by basically turning up with a gun and saying, again, me, the great leader, Trotsky, the prophet on earth, has decreed to you, the lowly peasants and workers, that you will go out and industrialize now. And by the way, collectivize while you're at it. Get to it. I'm shorthanding there slightly, but this is, again, like Trotsky's own biographer, Mandel, admits that was his policy when it came to the trade unions. That was his policy when it came to the peasants. Like, I have said it, therefore it must be. Whereas the argument expressed by Stalin and the argument that represented the majority on the Central Committee and in the Bolshevik Party's conferences all the way through the 1920s was that there needed to be persistent agitation amongst the workers to win them to this, that the trade unions were to be schools of industrial and political education, and that this was the method to do it, not barking orders at people, then going the militarized method. But that was Trotsky's, as we will see when we go through this book, that was Trotsky's answer when it comes to everything. He talks this big game about workers' rule, democratization, especially after he's exiled. But when he was in a position to actually affect policy, this was his answer, which is go down the route that he used in the Red Army. And he was unable to change those methods. And this, again, like, is why he was the authoritarian that he portrayed Stalin as being. When you read Trotsky's stuff in the 30s in particular, he's always going on about, this dreadful Stalinist clique dictating and lording it over the workers. Well, in actual fact, that was always his method. He reveals himself very plainly when it comes to the trade union question. But as we will see going through this book, bit by bit by bit, you will see that the authoritarian, the elitist, the man who actually believes that he should rule as a dictator is Trotsky. Over and over again, this is revealed. So that's the very first, quite short chapter summarized there. What I'm going to do in each of these episodes is it's obviously the first one, but I'm going to cover the chapter, and then what we'll do is we'll start the next week with questions from the previous chapter and carry on in that fashion. So let's now go back and pick up some comments. We've had Jenny join us. Good to have you with us. Ben says Trotsky had a serious superiority complex compared to everyone on Earth. Well, as Robert Bruce Lockhart, the British spy, said in a quote that's contained in the book, The Plot Against Soviet Russia, Trotsky would die for Russia as long as there was a big enough audience to watch him do it. James Goblin says, got to get up early tomorrow, so night folks, but I'll check the recording as usual. Good to have you here watching. Beju, good evening to you, comrade. Cobra Commander says, consciously involved in building infrastructure, according to Jackson Honkler, calling folks various different names is how you reach workers with communism. Well, all I will say about that is that opportunists always get exposed. And there are various opportunists, of which the man you described as Mr. Honkler is one of them. I mean, his recent embrace of Andrew fucking Tate should tell you what kind of guy he is. Muzzle Paint says, are there any books you would recommend on the 1917 Revolution and War Communism? Well, the 1917 Revolution and War Communism, the best book is actually, have I still got it here on the desk? Yes, I have. Hang on, I'm just reaching behind me. Yeah. The book to go with for all of this is The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. That's written by it's a book written by Stalin and the rest of the Central Committee in the 1930s, and it's a step-by-step account of the Bolshevik Party and its formation all the way through to the 1930s. That's the book to start off with. GCC Expro says, Trotsky the filth, indeed. Abtin says, interesting thought, the Rajavi family of the MEK in Iran were the Trotskyists of the Islamic Revolution. It's such a similar story. They were deeply sectarian and disconnected from the people. Weren't the MEK a strange combination of a certain interpretation of Shia Islam and like a certain, well, rather strange interpretation of Marxism? And if I'm correct in the history, didn't they end up siding with Saddam Hussein? And which, of course, didn't make them very popular at all, given that they sided with the invading Iraqi army. But yes, and they've ended up on the same side as many Trotskyists as well, which is fighting for U.S. imperialism. So yes, you're right. A number of similarities there. Koba says, sounds like Trotsky is starting with the ideal rather than the concrete. That's frequent criticism of him. Very true. Jeremy asks, were there trade unions amongst the working class before 1917? There were indeed some under Tsarism, some that were legal. There was a rather mixed picture because there were a series of legal trade unions in Russia prior to 1917, some of which were run by agents of the state. So they did exist, but there was a very mixed bag as to how effective they were. Jeremy asked, what year did food scarcity cease? I think that the scarcity that was the problem, the rationing had ended in terms of the shortages of food by about 23, 24. So within a couple of years, the new economic policy did do its job and actually restore a lot of food production. But it was hard for a good couple of years after the Civil War had ended. Cobra Commander says, the bourgeoisie adapt. Only an unserious communist does not have their ear to the factory floor, the voice of the masses. It's like the Grand Colosseum of Rome. Win the crowd, win the arena. Good points. Abtin says, yes, trade unions date back to the 1700s. Jerry says, that clarifies a lot of confusion. My experience is that workers happily muck in if there's a reason. And that's correct. If you can convince the masses that a hard work and sacrifice is necessary, then they will embrace it, especially if it's something which is being built by them for them. And then they think that I might not see much of this in terms of the benefit, but my children and grandchildren will, and people will be convinced by it. If Trotsky turns up with an armed guard and says, work harder, you're not going to do it. And again, we can see some of the devastating impacts of adoption of Trotskyite policies later on by Khrushchev. Rob says, Trotsky is already coming across really badly and we're barely 11 pages in. Yes, well, he doesn't come across any better in his own writings, Rob. I mean, I'll post the links to the Trotsky articles on the Telegram site, on the Telegram channel. When I the comparative articles from Trotsky, he doesn't come across any better in his own writing. Trust me. But take a look at it and reach your own judgment. Come back with any questions. Abtin says the MEK were Trotskyist ultra-revolutionaries siding with the CIA, Saddam Hussein, absolute traitors. I mean, similar to Trotskyists. Yes. Luca says, a Trotskyite friend replied to something I said about Stalin with, Stalin forced collectivization. Stalin was behind the famine. Stalin was a dictator. It's funny how all those are the same things that the Banderists in Ukraine say. I mean, we're going to be dealing with all of these questions as we go through the book, basically. And they didn't force collectivization, by the way. Collectivization was partly a result of pressure from the poorest peasants. Partly it was something that was done because it was necessary, but they built the collective farms as examples, and they offered incentives for peasants to go into them. The idea that Stalin was going around with a gun forcing people into collective farms, that's just simply not true. And again, Stalin behind the famine, that's just such transparent nonsense. Like the book by Douglas Tottle, Fraud, Famine and Fascism, it provides a comprehensive refutation of that. That's just a complete fiction, as do the studies by the American academic Mark Tauger, which you can find pretty easily online. And as for the Stalin was a dictator thing, again, we'll go through the building of the Soviet system, but the idea that one man could run the Soviet Union. I mean, have you seen the size of that place? The idea that Stalin was dictating every single thing and he was the man behind it all. Again, it's just, not only is it not true, but again, if we're going to get into the realm of psychoanalysis here, I mean, Trotsky was projecting. He did want to be the dictator. And it's pretty obvious when you start reading through his actual work about what he actually thought about himself and his place within things. Christopher Hitchens was a Trotskyist, asks Grassy Knoll. Indeed he was, and a particularly obnoxiously bad one at that. What was Stalin's view on the Kronstadt uprising? Well, that's an interesting question from Clinton, and you know what? We will probably come back to that on another episode. Clinton, can you make a note of your question? Because I've got to knock off in just a moment and bring it back later, because it's an important question to look at. So put a pin in that one and we'll come back to it. Hello to my comrade Terry Eaton, who joins us. Cobra Commander notes, well, relocation was implemented and there were some mistakes. For example, Korean migration within the USSR to defend against Japanese terrorism. This is I will not be arguing in this series that the Soviet leadership didn't make mistakes. They did, but again, what they did was that they examined their mistakes and learned from them, and didn't cover them up either. I think even Robert Conquest had to redact his lies, unlike Timothy Snyder, who is still a Yale historian. Yep. Snyder couldn't find an ounce of shame if you paid him. That's true. You'd have to pay him quite a bit. All right. So thank you, everybody, for joining me for this walk through the first chapter of Stalin's collection of Stalin's works on the opposition, where there will be another show on this next week. So if you have questions about this, then be sure to either put a pin in them and bring them to the chat section next week, or perhaps even better, email them to me at the usual address, and I'll respond to them at the beginning of next week's program. But thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. We'll be back again with a Victory Day program tomorrow. So please join me for that one. That will run from probably 7:30 in the evening until whenever we need to. Thanks to everybody again. See you tomorrow.